David had always prided himself on being the calm, composed type. At 40, he'd learned the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. This wasn't a man who rushed into confrontation or let his emotions dictate his decisions. But for the past few months, something had been gnawing at him. Laura, his wife of 10 years, had started to change. It wasn't the small, insignificant things, it was the little, consistent details that didn't add up. At first, it was the late nights she kept insisting were just work commitments, but the longer this went on, the more it didn't feel right. David had always trusted Laura, never suspecting that she would betray him. Yet the nagging doubts crept in slowly, like a shadow that stretched across his peace of mind. He noticed the way she came home later than usual, her smile a little too tight, her excuses a little too rehearsed. There was a strange tension in the air, but he said nothing. He wasn't one to act on a hunch. He needed proof, something concrete before he made a move. One evening, it finally happened. He had had a quiet dinner alone, scrolling through his phone, when he came across something odd. An alert from the local bar's security camera. It was the usual feed, but this time, there she was. Laura, walking into the bar at 7:45 p.m., looking entirely too relaxed, too happy. This was the same night she had told him she'd be working late at the office. Her behavior was suspicious, but this footage was the undeniable evidence David needed. His heart pounded, but he didn't rush. He didn't react in the heat of the moment. Instead, he quietly saved the footage and the images, each frame searing into his mind. He watched it again and again, not out of anger, but out of a need to fully absorb what he was seeing. Laura's betrayal was real, and it was right there on his screen. Clear as day. Rather than confronting her immediately, David took a deep breath, his thoughts already turning to his next step. He would wait. He would be calm, calculated. When the time was right, he would expose the truth, and when he did, it would be done with finality. The days after David's discovery were the hardest. He spent hours going over the footage, making sure it was exactly what he thought. Each time he saw Laura, the way she moved, her expression so casual and carefree, it filled him with a mix of emotions: hurt, disbelief, and above all, anger. How could she do this to him? How could she lie to his face, claiming to be working late, when all along she was meeting someone else? David wasn't a man prone to quick actions, especially when it came to emotions. He knew that rushing in without full evidence, without fully understanding the situation, could lead to mistakes. That's why he took his time, carefully putting everything in order. He couldn't confront Laura in the heat of the moment, not when his heart was in turmoil and his mind still trying to piece together the full story. Instead, he began a meticulous investigation. He watched the security footage from that night again, and then he went further, reviewing the footage from previous weeks. Each time, he saw the same thing: Laura slipping out of the house, her work attire swapped for something more casual, a look of anticipation in her eyes. She had been sneaking off, meeting someone David knew nothing about. The trust that had once been so solid between them was now crumbling before his eyes. David wasn't just gathering the evidence to satisfy his suspicions, he was building a case. He wanted Laura to know that when he confronted her, there would be no room for denial. He would lay it all out, piece by piece, until she could no longer hide behind her lies. But even as he worked tirelessly, there was a cold, calculating side to him that refused to let the emotions get in the way. This was about justice, not vengeance. He kept his discovery to himself, each day growing more distant from his wife. Their interactions had become strained, filled with an underlying tension that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Laura, seemingly unaware of David's growing suspicion, continued with her routine, her late nights, her excuses, and the way she looked at him as if nothing had changed. But David knew. He knew everything now. What made the situation even more painful was that David had always been patient with Laura. He had trusted her implicitly, never once doubting her loyalty. He had provided for her, supported her dreams, and stood by her side through thick and thin. Yet, she had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible. His thoughts spiraled, torn between the man he thought he knew and the stranger who was now standing in front of him every day. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the fact that Laura had believed she could keep it hidden, that she thought she could deceive him without consequences. That's when the idea of revenge started to form in David's mind. This wasn't going to be some dramatic confrontation where emotions ran high. He wasn't going to give Laura the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he would hit her where it hurt most, in a way that would leave no room for her to wiggle free. David had always been a methodical man, someone who thought before acting. This was no different. He had the proof. Now it was time to take the next step. He spent the following days planning how he would expose Laura. He didn't want to just confront her. He wanted to make sure that when the truth came to light, it would do the most damage. It had to be at the right moment, the perfect storm that would unravel everything she had worked so hard to hide. The more David thought about it, the clearer his plan became. He would send the incriminating photos of Laura with her affair partner to her boss. He would expose her betrayal in front of everyone at her workplace, forcing her to face the consequences of her actions in the worst possible way. The fallout would be inevitable, and he would stand back, watching it all unfold with a sense of cold satisfaction. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his own power, about taking control of his life again. Laura had taken so much from him, from their relationship, and he had let her. But now he was taking it back. He would be the one to decide how this story ended, not her. As he prepared to send the photos, a wave of calm washed over him. He had been methodical, patient, and now he was finally in control. This wasn't just about getting back at Laura for her betrayal. It was about showing her that he wasn't the fool she thought he was. David sent the email. With the click of a button, everything changed. The days that followed were tense. David could feel the weight of the decision he had made. It wasn't just about the photos, the evidence that now sat in his email inbox, ready to be sent. It was about the moment he would walk into their shared home, about the conversations that would follow. There was no going back now, no second guessing the actions he had set in motion. He had laid the trap carefully, and now all he had to do was wait for the right time. Laura, blissfully unaware of what David had discovered, continued her routine. She would come home at the usual time, always so focused on her phone or the latest project at work. To anyone who might have observed them, they appeared like a normal couple, no hints of the unraveling that David was planning in his mind. She was still making excuses, still sticking to the same tired script of late nights and business trips. But each day, as David watched her, he could see the cracks forming in their marriage more clearly than ever. The woman who had once been his partner was now a stranger, a woman capable of deceiving him, not even bothering to hide it well. It became clear to David that Laura was still playing the role of the loving wife when in fact she had already mentally checked out. The worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was how effortlessly Laura had convinced herself that her lies were justified. She'd wrapped her betrayal in such a web of excuses that, for a time, David had almost believed her. But now he saw it for what it truly was, a reflection of her disregard for him, for their life together, and for the marriage they had built. Still, David kept his cool. He remained composed, his emotions buried deep within him as he navigated the days leading up to the moment of truth. He had been patient for weeks, allowing the tension to build, all the while watching his wife's every move. The tension between them was palpable. She might have thought that things were normal, but David couldn't pretend anymore. The trust had been shattered, and the only thing that remained was the inevitable confrontation. Then the day came. David sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open before him. The photos, all neatly organized in a folder, stared back at him. He had already drafted the email to Laura's boss, carefully worded to ensure that there could be no mistaking the authenticity of the evidence. He wasn't just going to expose Laura in a quiet, controlled way. No, this had to be impactful. She had to face the consequences of her actions in the way he believed she deserved. With one final glance at the images of Laura and Eric, David clicked send. The seconds felt like hours. A cold silence enveloped the room as the email was delivered, its contents now in the hands of her boss. David could almost picture the unfolding chaos that would erupt the moment Laura's betrayal was exposed in front of her colleagues. He could imagine her sitting at her desk unsuspecting, only to be blindsided by the reality that her secret was no longer her own, the fear that would likely grip her when she realized that the man she thought she could deceive so easily had outplayed her at her own game. It was a satisfying thought, but David quickly pushed it aside. The truth would come out, and it would come in full force. He'd already made his peace with the fallout. What mattered now was that it was out of his hands. He had done his part. There was nothing left but to watch it unfold. Laura returned home that evening, her usual bright smile quickly replaced with confusion when she saw David sitting at the kitchen table staring at her in silence. She had no idea. She continued to chatter about her day, about work, about the same old mundane things she always talked about, but David could see it in her eyes. There was an undercurrent of tension between them, something that neither of them could ignore any longer. David had no intention of confronting her just yet. Not when she was still in the dark, thinking everything was fine. He wanted her to enjoy that last fleeting moment of normalcy before the storm hit. When she finally noticed his quiet gaze on her, she faltered for just a second, her eyes shifting uneasily, as if sensing that something was off. But Laura, ever the actress, quickly recovered and kept talking, oblivious to the fact that the truth was already on its way to shattering everything she had carefully built. The next morning, David woke up to a different atmosphere in the house. He hadn't slept well, but when he heard Laura's phone buzzing, he knew something had changed. The tone of her voice when she spoke to her boss was a giveaway. David could see the color drain from her face as the conversation went on, her tone shifting from polite professionalism to something more urgent, more defensive. And then the moment came. Laura dropped the phone, staring at it as if it had burned her hand. She looked up at David, eyes wide with shock and fear. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. David stood up, his face emotionless, and simply said, "You can't lie your way out of this, Laura. It's all there. I've been watching, and now everyone will know the truth." The morning after the email was sent, the house felt eerily quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. David watched as Laura paced through the house, her usual confident stride replaced by an unsteady, almost frantic energy. She was acting strange, flitting between disbelief and denial, her mind undoubtedly racing to make sense of the situation that had been so carefully constructed and so swiftly unraveled. She hadn't yet fully grasped the extent of what was happening, but the signs were there. The tense way she clutched her phone, the uneasy glances she kept throwing David's way, as though waiting for him to reveal that this was all some cruel mistake. But David remained calm, his hands once trembling from the weight of the decision had steadied now. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that Laura's deception had been exposed, and not just to him, but to her colleagues and boss, flooded his mind. The email he had sent, the one that contained irrefutable proof, would make sure of that. Laura's carefully maintained facade of a perfect marriage and professional life was no longer something she could control. For the first time in what felt like ages, David felt a sense of control returned to his life. As he sipped his coffee, he could hear her talking in the other room, trying to reach her boss. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, defensive, a woman caught in the act, desperate to salvage whatever she could from the wreckage she had caused. David could almost hear the rehearsed apology in her voice, the way she would surely try to explain it all away, to twist the truth into something more manageable. But he knew better now. He wasn't interested in her excuses. What he wanted, what he needed, was for her to face the consequences of her actions. She had been lying for too long, and now it was time for her to deal with the fallout. It wasn't long before Laura appeared in the doorway, her face pale and strained, her eyes searching his for any sign that this was all just a bad dream. "David, please," she started, her voice shaking. "You have to believe me. This isn't what it looks like. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her words were an attempt to grasp at any shred of control, but David wasn't buying it. He had already seen through the veneer of her charm, the false apologies and the excuses that had become a pattern over the past few months. "Don't," he said quietly, not even looking up from his coffee. "Don't try to explain. I've seen everything I need to see. The truth is already out there." His voice was steady, calm in a way that terrified Laura. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of the unspoken truth between them. "I can't believe you do this to me," David continued, his tone still controlled, though the hurt was palpable in his eyes. "I've been nothing but patient, nothing but supportive, and this is how you repay me? With lies? With secrets?" He finally set his coffee mug down, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "You didn't think I'd ever find out, did you? You thought you could get away with it." Laura opened her mouth to respond, but the words failed her. She wanted to defend herself, to claim that everything David was thinking was wrong, that this was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew. She knew there was no way to talk her way out of this. She had been caught. Her lies had finally caught up to her in the most public way imaginable. As Laura stood frozen in the doorway, trying to collect her thoughts, the phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from her boss, an urgent request for her to come into the office. David knew that her professional life would never be the same after today. The photos, the evidence of her affair with Eric had been sent, and the repercussions would ripple through her career. The truth could no longer be hidden behind polished office smiles and carefully curated reports. She would have to face the consequences, not just with him, but in front of everyone who had trusted her. "I'm sorry, David," Laura whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't know how to stop. It wasn't about you. It was about me, about what I needed. David stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. His eyes were cold, unblinking. You don't get to make excuses anymore, Laura. You made your choices. Now, you live with them. You can go to your boss, you can go to Eric, but don't expect me to feel sorry for you. As David walked out of the kitchen, the finality of the moment hung in the air. There would be no more conversations, no more second chances. Laura had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. The world she had carefully built was unraveling, and David was standing at the center of it, watching as everything she had fought to protect fell apart. The aftermath was inevitable, yet still, it was something David could hardly prepare for. The truth had shattered Laura's carefully crafted life, and now she was left to face the mess of her choices. The guilt, the anger, the shame, none of it could be masked anymore. Her facade, the one she had so confidently built, was now in ruins, and with every passing moment, the reality of what she had lost began to settle in. Her career, her marriage, her reputation, each of them had been sacrificed on the altar of her betrayal. David, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of liberation. He had taken control of his narrative, not through rage or reckless confrontation, but with patience and quiet precision. Watching Laura flounder in the wake of her lies, watching her struggle to salvage what she had destroyed, was both painful and satisfying. The man who had once been deceived now stood with the power to reclaim his life, his dignity, and his peace. And though he had not wanted this, though he had hoped to never be forced into this position, it was clear that it had become his only path forward. In the days that followed, David kept his distance. He did not seek revenge through petty acts or dramatic confrontations. Instead, he allowed the truth to do its work. Laura, now stripped of her pretenses, was left to confront the consequences of her actions. The fallout from her affair spread quickly, and the damage to her professional life was severe. Her boss had already called her in for a meeting, and word had begun to spread throughout the office. There was no escape, no way to hide from the truth. Laura had lost her grip on everything, and now it was up to her to pick up the pieces. David did not feel sympathy for her, but there was a part of him that understood the deeper tragedy of the situation. Laura, in her pursuit of fleeting satisfaction, had sacrificed the very things that had once mattered to her. She had betrayed him, yes, but in the process, she had destroyed her own identity, one built on trust, respect, and a shared future. As the days passed, David made no move to reconcile. He had long accepted that their marriage, as it had once been, was no more. There was no going back to the way things were, no way to reverse the damage that had been done. He had made his peace with that. What mattered now was his own future, his own journey, separate from the woman who had once been his partner. By the end of the week, Laura was no longer a part of his life in any meaningful way. She moved out, taking only the remnants of her belongings, leaving behind the shattered memories of their time together. David watched her go, not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet sense of finality. He had not been defeated, he had taken back control. For David, this was the beginning of something new. The weight of the past no longer held him down. The justice he had sought, the emotional clarity had been achieved, not through revenge, but through self-restoration. The hardest part was over. Now he could rebuild his life on his terms.